My daughter-in-law told me Shadow was gone. Just like that. Standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, holding a coffee she'd poured herself, telling me my late husband's cat had been humanely surrendered to a shelter 2 counties over because, in her words, the dander was triggering Tyler's asthma. My name is Eleanor. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same white clapboard house in Stowe, Vermont for 41 years. My husband Harold and I bought it the year after we married, when he was still doing his residency at Copley Hospital, and I was teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school down the road. We raised our son Jason in this house. We watched maples turn gold every October from the porch swing Harold built with his own 2 hands. And when Harold died of pancreatic cancer 2 springs ago, this house and a 14-pound Maine Coon cat named Shadow were the 2 things I had left of him. Shadow was Harold's last gift to me. 3 months before he passed, when the chemo wasn't working anymore and we both knew what was coming, Harold drove all the way out to a breeder in Sherbrooke without telling me. He came home with this enormous grey and white kitten in a carrier, and a sheepish look on his face. "Ellie," he said, "I can't stand the thought of you rattling around this house alone. Promise me you'll let him keep you company." I promised. And for 2 years that cat did exactly that. He slept on Harold's pillow. He sat in the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon, waiting for me to come back from my walks. He'd put one heavy paw on my knee when I cried, which was often, especially that first year. So when Brittany sat across from me at my own kitchen table and casually informed me she'd taken Shadow to a shelter while I was at my Thursday quilting circle, something inside me just stopped working for a minute. My hands went numb. I remember staring at the sugar ball Harold's mother gave us as a wedding gift and thinking, very calmly, she walked into my house and took him. "You did what?" I finally said. Brittany did this little sigh she does, the one that means she's about to explain something to me like I'm a slow child. She's 34, blonde, manicured, married to my Jason for 6 years. "Eleanor, we talked about this. Tyler's been wheezing every time we visit. The pediatrician said it's the cat. I just thought you've been so tired lately, and honestly, at your age, a cat that big is a lot of work. You should be enjoying retirement, not cleaning a litter box. At my age." She'd said it 3 times in the last month. "Where?" I said. My voice came out flat. "Which shelter?" "The county one over in St. Johnsbury." "Honey, please don't make this into a thing. They'll find him a good home. He's a beautiful cat." I asked her for the name of the shelter. She told me she couldn't remember. I asked her when. She said Monday while I was at my book club. I hadn't gone to book club on Monday. I'd gone to the cemetery to put fresh marigolds on Harold's grave, the way I do every week. But I didn't correct her. I just nodded and I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, and I told her I needed to lie down. She left 20 minutes later, kissing me on the cheek and saying she'd bring Tyler by for Sunday dinner. The minute her white BMW pulled out of my driveway, I started calling shelters. I called every animal shelter within 100 miles. The one in St. Johnsbury had no record of any cat being surrendered on Monday or Tuesday or any day that week. Neither did the one in Lindell or Newport or Hardwick or the Humane Society in Burlington. By 8 o'clock that night, I'd spoken to 19 different people, and not one of them had seen a 14-pound silver Maine Coon with a white chest and one slightly crooked ear. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark and tried to think clearly. Why would Brittany lie? Why would she take my cat and tell me a story that didn't match a single fact? I'd known something wasn't right for a while. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Jason and Brittany had been over a lot more in the past 6 months. Helpful, Brittany called it, checking on me. Jason would come fix things around the house, a porch step that wasn't loose, a faucet that wasn't dripping. Brittany would go through my mail to help me organize. She'd offered twice now to take a look at the finances with me because she'd taken a class on elder finance management. The second time she'd brought paperwork, forms, a power of attorney, she said, just in case. Just in case what? I'd asked. In case you have a stroke, Eleanor, God forbid, she'd said, laughing like it was nothing. I hadn't signed it. Harold left me well taken care of. The pension, his life insurance, the house paid off, a brokerage account he'd been building since the 80s. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, and I was perfectly capable of managing my own checkbook. Always had been. Sitting there in the dark, I kept coming back to one thought. Shadow didn't like Brittany. Never had. From the very first time she came into the house, that cat would leave the room. If she sat on the couch, he'd jump down. If she tried to pet him, he'd flatten his ears and slink away. Harold used to laugh about it. Ellie, that cat's a better judge of character than half the people I work with. I went to bed that night with my chest hurting in a way it hadn't since the week Harold died. 5 days passed. I didn't tell Jason. I don't know why exactly. Some instinct, maybe, that told me to wait. I went to my quilting circle on Thursday and didn't say a word. I bought a small bag of cat food at the feed store on Friday and put it in the pantry, even though I knew it didn't make sense. On Saturday night, I left the kitchen window cracked open, the way I always did when Shadow was around, even though it was 40 degrees out and my heating bill would be a nightmare. It rained Sunday morning. A cold, hard, late October rain that stripped the last leaves off the sugar maples. I was in the kitchen heating up oatmeal when I heard something at the back door, a soft thump, then a scratching sound. I thought it was a branch. The wind had been bad all night, but it kept going. Thump, scratch, thump. I went to the back door and looked through the glass. Shadow was on the porch, soaking wet, thinner than I'd ever seen him, with a long scrape down one side and his fur matted with what looked like dried blood. And around his neck, where his blue collar with the little silver bell had been a different collar, a black nylon one I'd never seen before, with something hanging off it. I opened the door and dropped to my knees on the cold porch boards, and that cat walked straight into my chest like nothing had happened, like he hadn't been gone a week, like he'd just been out for an evening stroll. He was shaking. His paws were a mess. The pads were cracked and bleeding in places. He smelled like damp earth and motor oil and something chemical I couldn't place. I carried him inside. I wrapped him in the good towels from the linen closet. I warmed a small dish of milk. I know you're not supposed to give cats milk, but I needed to do something with my hands, and I sat on the kitchen floor in my robe, and I just held him while he ate and shivered. Then I looked at the collar. It was a cheap nylon thing, the kind you buy at a hardware store, but hanging from the buckle attached with what looked like fishing line was a small black plastic rectangle, about the size of a stick of gum, a USB drive, black, no logo, the kind you can buy in a 5-pack at any office supply store. My hands started shaking so badly I had to set Shadow down. I unhooked the collar carefully and laid it on the table. The USB drive was scratched and there was dirt in the connector port. I sat there looking at it for what must have been 10 minutes before I picked up my phone. I called Walter Henson. Walter and Harold had been friends since the 70s. Walt was a retired state police detective, 28 years on the force, 3 of them on a federal task force that worked organized crime up through the New England corridor. He'd been one of Harold's pallbearers. He'd called me every Sunday for a year after the funeral to check on me, and we'd settled into a kind of friendship. I treasured he'd come over for coffee, fix something Harold would have fixed, and never once made me feel like a charity case. He picked up on the second ring. "Ellie, everything okay?" I tried to tell him. I'm not proud of how it came out. I was crying by the second sentence, talking about Brittany and the shelter and Shadow being gone. And now suddenly here, soaking wet, with a USB drive tied to his neck. Walt listened without interrupting once. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Don't put the USB in your computer," he said. "Don't touch it more than you already have. I'm coming over. 40 minutes. Eleanor, is anyone in the house with you?" No, lock the doors. Both of them, I'll be there. He hung up. I locked the doors. Both of them, I'll be there. He hung up. I locked the doors. I sat on the kitchen floor with Shadow in my lap, and I watched the rain come down on Harold's porch swing, and I waited. Walt arrived in 35 minutes. He came in stamping water off his boots, set down a small black case I didn't recognize, and squatted down to look at Shadow. He was 69 years old, grey buzz cut, retired, but still built like a man who could break down a door if he had to. "Hey, buddy," he said quietly to the cat. Shadow let Walt touch him, which surprised me. Then Walt looked up. "Eleanor, that cat needs a vet." "I'm not kidding. Those paw pads are infected and he's dehydrated." I know. I needed to call you first. You did the right thing." He stood up. "Listen to me. I'm going to call Dr. Marsh. Roger Marsh runs the clinic out on Route 100. He was a Navy vet. He's discreet. He'll come here. I don't want you driving anywhere with that cat tonight. And I don't want anyone seeing him." I nodded. He made the call. Then he opened his case and took out a laptop, an old, beat-up one with a piece of tape over the camera and a little grey device with a USB port on it. "What is that?" I asked. "Right blocker. Lets me read the drive without modifying it. Old habits." He gave me a small smile. "You okay if I take a look, please?" He worked for almost an hour. Dr. Mel. Marsh arrived in the middle of it, a kind, soft-spoken man in his late 60s who took Shadow into the living room, cleaned his wounds, gave him fluids, and pronounced him dehydrated and exhausted, but not in danger. He stayed long enough to administer antibiotics and leave instructions. He took a small payment in cash and asked no questions. I'll never forget him for that. When Walt finally looked up from the laptop, his face had changed. There's a look retired cops get. I'd seen it on Harold, on the rare cases he brought home with him, where the eyes go flat and the jaw sets and everything friendly drains out of the face for a minute. That was the look Walt had. "Eleanor," he said, "I need you to sit down." "What is it?" "Sit down." I sat. He turned the laptop toward me. There were folders, dozens of them. Photographs, scanned documents, audio files, PDFs of bank statements. "Your daughter-in-law," Walt said slowly, "has been running a long con, not just on you, on at least 4 other women I can identify just from a quick look at this drive." The room tilted just a little. "What do you mean?" He walked me through it, slowly, the way you'd explain something to a child you didn't want to scare. The USB drive contained what looked like a working file someone had been compiling. Photographs of Brittany meeting with 3 other older women in cafes and parking lots in 3 different towns. Photographs of her going into a notary's office in Burlington with what looked like power of attorney documents. Scanned copies of those documents, signed by women whose names I didn't recognize. Bank records, I couldn't read them from where I was sitting, showing transfers from those women's accounts to an LLC registered in Brittany's maiden name. Voice recordings, which Walt didn't play for me yet, of phone conversations between Brittany and someone she called Marco. "Eleanor," Walt said, "your daughter-in-law has cleaned out at least 3 elderly widows in the past 2 years. Total comes to something north of $400,000 from what I can see on a first pass. There's also," he hesitated, "there's also a folder on here with your name on it. Photos of your house, notes on your routine, a printed-out copy of your husband's will, and what looks like a draft of a new power of attorney with your signature on it. A forged signature." I couldn't speak. "The kicker," Walt said, "is that whoever put this drive together wasn't building a scam file. They were building a case file. This is evidence somebody was collecting against her. Someone who knew what she was doing and was documenting it." "Who?" I whispered. Walt looked at me for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said gently, "do you have any idea who would have had access to enough information to put this together? Someone who could photograph her at meetings, Someone who would have known to keep copies of every document she touched in your house. I didn't answer right away, but I was looking at the table, at the cat at my feet, at the kitchen window where Harold used to sit and drink his coffee in the morning, watching the road. Harold had been retired 4 years when he was diagnosed, but before that he'd been a doctor for 40 years. And in the last 18 months of his life, when he started getting tired and started staying home more, he'd taken on what he called his little projects. He'd never told me what they were. He'd just spend hours in his study with the door closed, on the phone, and sometimes, I remembered this now with a chill, sometimes he'd come out and ask me strange questions. "Ellie, have you noticed Brittany asking about money lately? Has she ever brought paperwork over for you to sign?" I'd brushed it off. Harold was sick. He worried about everything. He'd been a doctor too long. He saw threats everywhere. But Harold had been a Navy corpsman in Vietnam before he became a doctor. And his older brother had been killed in a financial fraud scheme in the 90s, an elder fraud case that had nearly destroyed their mother before she died. Harold had spent 30 years of his life paying close attention to scams targeting older people. He'd written op-eds about it for the Burlington Free Press. If Harold had suspected his own daughter-in-law was running a con on widows, he wouldn't have come to me with it, not without proof. Not until he was sure. He'd have built a case quietly, the way he did everything, the way he made sure every prescription he wrote was triple-checked, and then he'd gotten sick, and then he'd died, and the case file had been sitting somewhere, and someone or something had brought it back to me at the last possible moment. "Shadow," I said. "Walt, the cat, where was he for 5 days?" Walt was already turning the USB drive over in his hand. "Eleanor, this collar isn't a pet collar. This is a tracker collar. You can see the loop here, where there used to be a small GPS unit. Somebody took the unit off, but they didn't take the drive. My guess?" He looked up. "Somebody had this cat. Somebody who knew what they were doing. Somebody who tied that drive to him and let him come home. Who that," Walt said, "is what I'd like to find out. It took 3 weeks. Walt called a friend at the state police the next morning. A young investigator named Diaz he'd mentored years back. They came to my house quietly in an unmarked car, and they took the drive into evidence. They told me not to talk to Brittany, not to talk to Jason, to act normal. You try acting normal when you've just learned the woman married to your son has been robbing widows blind and was preparing to do it to you. I cooked Sunday dinner that next week. Pot roast and mashed potatoes, the way Brittany liked it. She and Jason and Tyler came over. Brittany asked me twice, in a soft, fake concerned voice, how I was coping with the loss of Shadow. I told her I was doing my best. I told her I'd been thinking about that power of attorney she brought over. Her eyes lit up. I watched it happen across the kitchen table. I watched my daughter-in-law's face transform when she thought she was about to win. "Oh, Eleanor, that's so smart of you," she said. "Why don't I bring it by next Tuesday? We can sit down with a notary just to make it official." "That sounds perfect," I said. I held it together until they left. Then I went into the bathroom and threw up. Tuesday came. So did Brittany. So did a notary brought with her, a nervous-looking woman who I later learned was being paid in cash and had no idea what she was a part of. So did 3 plainclothes state police investigators, 2 of them sitting in an unmarked van on Maple Street, and one of them sitting in my upstairs bedroom listening to every word through a wire I'd been wearing for 40 minutes. I signed nothing. I asked Brittany questions instead. Questions Walt and Diaz had given me. Brittany, what exactly does this document let you do? Brittany, will you have access to my brokerage account? Brittany, why does this paragraph mention the house? She answered every one of them. Smooth, practiced, lying through perfect teeth. They arrested her on my front porch at 4:17 in the afternoon, in front of the notary, in front of her own car. She didn't cry. She just looked at me, really looked at me, for maybe the first time in 6 years, and her face was a mask of pure, cold contempt. "You stupid old bitch," she said. The notary fainted. Jason came over that night. He'd been picked up at his office and questioned. They cleared him within 4 hours. He hadn't known. He really hadn't. He sat at my kitchen table and cried like a little boy. My Jason, 41 years old, head in his hands, asking me over and over how he could have missed it. I made him tea. I sat with him. I told him what his father had always told him when he was small, and something terrible happened. You didn't cause this, and you can't fix it tonight, but you'll get through it. The case went to trial 7 months later. It turned out Brittany's real name wasn't Brittany. She'd been Bridget Kowalski in Akron, Ohio, where she had a fraud conviction from 2009 under a different married name. The Marco on the voice recordings was Marco Vance, a paralegal in Burlington who'd been forging notarizations for her in exchange for a cut. He pled out in exchange for testifying. 3 of the 4 widows in the file were still alive. One had died of a stroke 6 months after Brittany cleaned out her savings. Her family sat in the front row at the sentencing. Brittany got 18 years in federal prison. Wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial exploitation across state lines. The judge, a woman in her 60s, called it one of the most calculated patterns of predatory abuse she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. She gave Brittany the high end of the sentencing guidelines and recommended against early release. It still doesn't feel like enough. Not really. But it's something. The USB drive, it turned out, hadn't been Harold's. Not directly. A retired private investigator named Frank Castellano, 74 years old, lived in a little farmhouse outside Hyde Park. Walt found him by working backwards through the metadata on the photographs. Frank had known Harold for 30 years. They'd met when Frank's wife was Harold's patient. When Harold got sick, he'd hide Frank off the books to start looking into Brittany. Frank had built the file over 14 months. After Harold died, Frank had kept going on his own dime because he'd given Harold his word. The day Brittany took Shadow, she'd driven him in a carrier to a parking lot off Route 15, planning to dump him at a kill shelter in another county. Frank had been following her. He'd been following her for weeks. He'd seen her take the cat. He'd waited until she went into a gas station bathroom, broken into her car with a Slim Jim, and taken the carrier out. Frank kept Shadow for 5 days at his farmhouse. He fed him tuna and chicken, and on the morning he decided he had enough on the drive to bring it to me. He put the cheap nylon collar on Shadow and drove him to the woods behind my property and let him go. Why didn't he just bring it to me himself? I asked Walt much later. He wanted you to find it the way Harold would have wanted you to find it, Walt said. He wanted you to know your husband had been watching out for you. And he didn't trust that you'd believe a stranger walking up to your porch with a USB drive in a wild story. Frank Castellano died of heart failure 4 months after the trial ended. I drove up to his funeral in Hyde Park. His daughter cried when I introduced myself. She said her father had kept a framed photo of Harold on his desk for the last 2 years of his life. Shadow is in my lap as I write this. He'll be 6 years old this spring. The scrape on his side healed into a thin white line, and the pads of his paws are perfect again. He sleeps on Harold's pillow. He sits in the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon. He still doesn't like strangers, and he still has one slightly crooked ear. Jason comes for dinner every Sunday. He brought a divorce lawyer in the 2nd week after the arrest, and the divorce was final last March. Tyler, my grandson, who turned out not to have asthma at all, who'd been coached to wheeze whenever he came to my house lives with Jason, full time now. He's 7. He calls Shadow the spy cat. He'll only eat my pot roast, not anybody else's. He asks about his grandfather a lot. I tell him stories. I tell him about a man who knew, somehow, that the people we love most need protecting even after we're gone. A man who paid a stranger to keep watch over his wife because he wasn't going to be there to do it himself. A man who tied his promise to a cat's collar and let it find its way home in the rain. And I tell him the only thing I've learned really in 68 years of being on this earth: trust the animals, trust the people who loved you, and if something in your gut tells you the smiling woman across the kitchen table is wrong, you listen. You listen even when she's family, especially when she's family. Harold knew that. So did Shadow. I'm just grateful I learned it before it was too late. I've thought about it 1,000 times in the months since the trial ended, sitting at the same kitchen table where it all started, and the same thought keeps coming back to me. Nothing that happened was an accident. Not one piece of it. Brittany didn't fall into our family by chance. She found us because Harold had money, because I was getting older, because Jason was the kind of trusting man who believed his wife loved him the way he loved her. She studied us. She moved slowly. She was patient in the way only a person without a conscience can be patient. And every cup of coffee she poured in this kitchen, every Sunday dinner she ate at my table was a calculation. I didn't see it because I didn't want to see it. That was my failing, and I own it. But Harold saw it. Harold, who barely had the strength to walk to the mailbox in his last months, saw what I couldn't see standing next to him every day. And instead of frightening me, instead of making my last months with him about something ugly, he quietly paid a stranger named Frank Castellano to keep watch. He died believing the safety net would hold. And it did. That's the part I want anybody listening to remember. Love doesn't end at the funeral. The good things people do for us echo forward in ways we can't always see. Harold's care for me didn't stop when he stopped breathing. It was still working 2 years later, on a rainy Sunday morning, when a half-starved cat walked onto my back porch with the truth tied to his collar. There's a hardness in me now that wasn't there before. I don't apologize for it. At 68 years old, I finally learned that being kind is not the same as being soft, and being trusting is not the same as being a fool. When Brittany kept saying, "at your age," and "let me help you with the finances," my gut told me something was wrong. I ignored my gut because I wanted to be the good mother-in-law, the easygoing one, the woman who didn't make trouble. That instinct to keep the peace almost cost me everything. Harold worked his whole life to leave me. So I tell my grandson Tyler now when he visits that the smartest thing he can do as he grows up is to listen to the quiet voice in his chest when something feels off. I tell him that real strength isn't loud. Frank Castellano was quiet strength. Walter was quiet strength. Harold, sick and dying, was quiet strength. None of them stood on a chair shouting. They just refused to look away. And Shadow, that big silver cat curled against my hip as I write this, was quiet strength too. He couldn't speak, but he carried what mattered home through the rain, and he laid it at my feet, and he trusted me to be brave enough to look at it. I was. Finally, I was.